already. I would like to thank everybody. We are here because in late 1915, Einstein completed 3 papers on the general theory of relativity that constitute the occasion for this week's symposium. 10 years earlier, during his miraculous year of 1905, Einstein had jettisoned the manuscripts of the special theory of relativity and his revolutionary proposals for a quantum theory of light and of matter in 1906. By 1915, however, the 36-year-old Einstein was becoming aware of the potential significance, importance, and value of original manuscripts. He now kept hold of his draft calculations, of his notebooks, his correspondence, and his diaries. 90 years ago, in the spring of 1925, as we shall publish in our upcoming volume, he donated the manuscript of his comprehensive exposition on general relativity to the Hebrew University on its official opening in British Mandate of Palestine. Starting in 1919, he had devoted much fundraising efforts on behalf of this institution and had laid its symbolic cornerstone here early in 1923 when he visited Palestine. And despite at times vehement disagreements about the constitution and management and organization of the Hebrew University, the incipient institution, he remained devoted to the Hebrew University until his death 60 years ago in 1955. So this week's conference, as we have already heard, expertly crafted by Yemima and by Jürgen, around developments in space-time concepts since 1915, gives occasion to celebrate some additional anniversaries. Fully cognizant of the value of even his casual jottings, Einstein and those with whom he worked most closely retained all his papers, his Nachlassen, to leave behind. And this Nachlass was thought to contain about 1,000 writings, scientific and non-scientific writings, drafts, published and unpublished, speeches, diaries, lectures, calculations. But by the time the collected papers of Albert Einstein edition will be completed, our great-grandchildren will have the duty and the honor to do that. I estimate that the number of Einstein writings that we will have published will be closer to 2,000 rather than 1,000. The Albert Einstein Archives in Jerusalem and the Einstein Papers Project currently hold, by my latest calculation as of this summer, a correspondence consisting of about 12,500 letters written by Einstein and about 16,500 letters that he received. That's what we have as of now. This number, too, will grow as research on each new volume is carried out by the talented and devoted 2 groups of editors, researchers, and archivists present in the room today. We heard, and here I wanted you to see, that Einstein indeed did send the manuscript to Mr. Tomlinson. And there is the envelope of the meaning of relativity that he sent to Princeton University after he gave his famous Stafford lectures in 1921. With a total about 30,000 unique documents, Einstein's Nachlass is similar in size to that of Napoleon, twice that of Darwin and Leibniz, and several times that of Galileo and Newton. Now, Einstein had been privy to the fate of Newton's papers when, in the 1930s, they were auctioned and bought by John Maynard Keynes and Abraham Yehuda, among others. In his last interview, conducted in 1955 with my esteemed and beloved missed teacher, I. Bernard Cohen, Einstein commented that certain boundaries should be placed on the posthumous publication of scientists' unpublished writings. Given that some of these writings are incorrect or plain silly, as he thought of some of Newton's writings. Letters, on the other hand, Einstein accepted would become fair game for later generations, even though they might contain, I quote, some personal things that should not be published. During his lifetime, we know that he destroyed most of the letters written to him by his wife Elsa, and, for example, his young secretary, Betty Neumann, the letters to whom we're publishing in the upcoming volume 14, with whom he had a brief affair in 1924. But he destroyed these letters at their request. But he never asked that his own letters to them be concealed or destroyed. He was not much concerned with posterity's judgment of his private life. Yet when the Einstein edition was initially conceived in the late 1970s, its advisory board had a strong desire to publish as quickly as possible, as Jürgen remembers, Einstein's scientific papers, published and unpublished, while his correspondence was deemed, in particular by the physicist advisors on the board, as less significant. Yet subsequently, with some exceptions, most of the Einstein scholars and editors agreed that both writings and correspondence should be accorded serious attention. So I would like to acknowledge the contribution of past and present editors who are participating in our conference, in order to stress the importance of these primary sources for scholarship in the history and philosophy of physics, mathematics, and astronomy that goes beyond the persona of Einstein alone. Jürgen Wren, Tilman Sauer, Michel Janssen, who couldn't come, Daniel Kennefic, who is late because his flight was canceled, Issachar Una, Jeroen van Dongen, and Dennis Leemkuhl are all going to talk to us at this conference. So in about 3 weeks, when the press will send out copies of the 14th volume of the edition, covering the years 1923 to mid-1925, and I brought a jacket for everybody to see. Can circulate it. A period during which Einstein is best known for his work on Bose statistics. But he was remarkably productive in the scope of his other preoccupations. Of greatest interest, I believe, in the last few volumes of the Einstein papers, is his involvement during the early and mid-1920s with a large number of new experimental ventures designed to test a broad range of subjects, from superconductivity to the particle wave nature of light, the Compton experiment, the BKS theory, various speculations on what he called the electromagnetic budget or bookkeeping of the Earth, and about the relationship between quantum theory and classical field theory, topics that have come to light only through careful examination of his and others' correspondence and diaries, not writings, not published papers, not unpublished papers, but through correspondence. So far, these 14 volumes contain more than 7,000 documents, as you've heard. A month ago, we published them online, the first 13, and in many cases, a high-definition scan of the original manuscript can also be accessed at the Albert Einstein archives, and we very much hope that more refinements and manuscripts will become linked to the digital edition soon, and this gives me the opportunity to mention how much we rely on the assistance of our colleagues, in particular Barbara Wolf, who is an extraordinarily devoted reader of our material and helps us on a daily basis and saves us from errors and embarrassments, and to Ronnie Gross and Chaya Becker. While both the correspondence and some of the writings range from the trivial to the sublime, together they constitute not only a panorama of an extraordinarily productive, disciplined, and talented scientist, fully engaged with his colleagues, friends, and family, and significant political, social, and humanitarian issues, but also of a century of science and politics, art and culture, populated by thousands of individuals whose paths intersected through Einstein. Interest in Einstein seems to grow with each passing decade and each passing anniversary. For the young Einstein during the period 1900 to 1905, when he was extraordinarily productive and wrote some 32 scientific papers and reviews, at the time, the editors were aware, this is not, of less than 100 letters. And over the next decade, the number of manuscripts, lectures, and articles rises to some 115 and 800 letters. But after he became a member of the Prussian Academy with his papers on general relativity, and especially after the confirmation by the British Eclipse Expedition, as you can see, the numbers changed dramatically. Not coincidentally, when the general theory was generating tremendous curiosity and also opposition, some 25 books were published about Einstein in a single year. Similar peaks occurred shortly after his death in 1955, again on his birth centenary in 1979, and the centenary of the miraculous year in 2005. To date, some 1,700 individual books on Einstein, let's see if I have that, no, are listed in library catalogs. In subsequent decades, Einstein received hundreds of unsolicited requests for advice, invitations to give public lectures, and appeals for endorsements of products ranging from books and pianos to political gatherings, and even, in our current volume 15, the new field of sexual research, to which he replied very humorously. In the 1930s, many of his letters concerned the immediate future of Europe's Jews. In the two most fateful years, 1938 and 1939, Einstein exchanged more than 2,500 letters, nearly 800 of them with completely new correspondents, testifying to his willingness to write affidavits and offer succor for Jewish refugees. However, over most of his life, the majority of his letters were exchanged with a narrow circle of family, friends, and scientists. I don't want to bore you with too many statistics. I did this for the volumes that we have already published. To the latter group of scientists, Einstein writes in simple, direct prose, devoid of adjectives and adverbs, never ingratiating himself, but also never resorting to professorial hauteur, as some of his colleagues did. By far the most fascinating and rich correspondence is with Paul Ehrenfest, arguably Einstein's closest friend. Their letters always deal with difficult scientific topics, but also the music and music playing they both enjoyed, politics, reports on their children, and arrangements for numerous visits of Einstein to Leiden. For example, in 1922, in one of the letters to Ehrenfest, Einstein writes, "It is actually good that I have so many distractions, because otherwise the quantum problem would have driven me to the insane asylum long ago. The fact that light emitted in diametrically different directions can interfere has supposedly been irrefutably demonstrated. How is that supposed to be reconciled with the energetic directedness of elementary processes? How pitifully the theoretical physicist stands before nature and his students." With Born, Laue, Lorentz, Planck, and Sommerfeld, physics predominates, but nevertheless, each of these exchanges has its own tone and style. Born and Sommerfeld allow themselves to be patronizing and even intrusive, instructing and exhorting Einstein whenever they disagree with his public statements or appearances. Einstein handles them gingerly. Whereas with Lorentz, he's differential, but also frank, almost intimate and confessional. expressing his great love and admiration on numerous occasions. Despite scientific and other disagreements, he made superhuman efforts to maintain loyal relationships with Planck, Nernst, Warburg, and Sommerfeld, who had fostered his career in the early years. Yet on the issue of international reconciliation and pacifism, he faced lack of understanding and even outright opposition from these former supporters. He was convinced that post-war reconstruction, rather than aiming to settle the furious debates over war guilt, should become a focal point of efforts to bring about reconciliation. Fellow academician Emil Warburg persisted in opposing the election of French scholars to the Prussian Academy of Sciences. Confronted with pressures to conform to prevailing sentiments, as for example by Planck, Einstein continued to advocate that, in times of political tension, it was the main duty of all scholars to keep science and relations between researchers free from any political influences. And when his well-being and even his life were threatened, he decided on several occasions to remain in Germany as a sign of loyalty to these Berlin colleagues. In 1923, when the first edition of Einstein's collected scientific papers was published in Japan, Einstein wrote in the introduction that there is a certain charm to reading the original papers of a scientist rather than in a digested form by later commentators, analysts, or scientists. He was referring to his own work, published almost 2 decades earlier. He always argued that scientific theories cannot be falsified, but that experiment is the final judge. And in a speculative paper on superconductivity, he had written that the theoretical scientific researcher is not to be envied because nature, or more precisely put, experiment, is a merciless and not very kindly judge of his efforts. She never says yes to a theory, in the best of cases merely perhaps, but in most cases simply no. If an experiment agrees with the theory, it means perhaps. If it does not agree, then it means no. But as a historian of science, Einstein concluded that every theory is sure to experience its no someday. Most theories already do so soon after their formulation. And he felt very fortunate, and I presume he would feel very fortunate today, were he in this room with us, that his work has survived in its most significant outlines for 100 years. He did not expect it, and we have many statements to that effect. He also understood and emphasized that we constantly reshape historical events and personalities in our image. By that I mean that we reshape them in light of our present conceptions of science, of truth, of beauty, of justice. He witnessed during his own lifetime many distortions of his work, his writings, and facts about his life. As he wrote in the 1950s to Max Brod, Kafka's friend and literary executor, who did not listen to Kafka and kept his papers. He wrote to Max Brod, "So many bucketfuls of lies and misrepresentations have been written about him that had he paid attention, they would have driven him to an early death." So he was very well aware of his position and of the malleability and dangers of historical artifacts and interpretations. Half a century later, we're still trying to fit Einstein and his work into our own frameworks in the history and philosophy of science. We are also attributing to him various epistemological and methodological positions, often neglecting to carefully ascertain the precise context and the motivation or reason for one or the other of his particular statements. And here I'm thinking, for example, in our latest volumes, of an introduction that he wrote to a book that was reissued by Felix Eberty. And when some criticism came about as to why he had contributed to this book, and Kip Thorne might be interested to know that the book explained time travel in a very, very interesting way, and it was an almost 150-year-old book, Einstein replied, "Yes, I know Eberty doesn't have his relativity of space and time correct, make some mistakes, but I did this as a favor to the old Gregor Itelson. Now, if we don't know these letters, we may have all sorts of interpretations about why Einstein wrote this introduction. So the correspondence is very illuminating in every such case. We now hope that the online edition of Einstein's writings will impel us all to perform careful and detailed analysis of the historical specificity and the context of his and his colleagues' pronouncements. It will be revealed what remarkable new findings may lie ahead, as Jürgen Renn beautifully exemplified with a search for Einstein's use of the word widerspruchslos, free from contradictions, a pillar of Einstein's arguments for consistency and a tool of discovery for him over the years. But we can expand this enterprise. We can further demolish some other myths. How about a search for beauty, truth, justice, mentioned earlier? An online search of the 13 volumes reveals how very few are the occurrences of these major themes in his writings. In fact, with regard to beautiful or beauty, and a lot of ink has been spilled about the significance of consistency, aesthetics, beauty in Einstein's work. With regard to beautiful or beauty, we find only 3 non-trivial examples over 45 years connected to science. In 1911, after the first Solvay conference, he described Lorentz as a living work of art. Nobody knows anything, he wrote, about the physics crisis in quantum theory. He writes about the departed beautiful mechanics. This is the first occurrence of beauty associated with physics. At about the same time, he complained about his Prague students' lack of interest in my beautiful field. He only had 1 halfway decent male student and 2 female students in his seminar in Prague. And also at about the same time, he congratulated Max von Laue for his beautiful experiment on the diffraction of X-rays. And that's about it with regard to science, only 3 occurrences. And now what about truth? That perennial companion to scientific inquiry. We actually find very few instances, most of them exceedingly casual. Of course, he addresses on many occasions, starting in 1917, as we shall hear later today from Hanoch and Jürgen. Of course, starting in 1917, he discusses the truth of a geometrical proposition. But Einstein uses quotation marks in his famous book on the special and the general theory of relativity. In fact, he prefers to use validity of construction and elaborates on the limited truth of Euclidean geometry. He emphasizes that we can, in principle, discuss the truth of axioms, but that these truths are founded on incomplete experience. For Einstein, the truth of a theory lies in its ability to correlate a large number of single observations. As he wrote after the 1919 eclipse expedition, in the essay on induction and deduction in physics, the actual course of science rests on a hypothetical deductive method and on explicit falsificationist contentions. And I quote, "While the truth of a theory can never be proven, the theory itself can be proven wrong by experiment in the future." A few years later, in 21, he wrote that one ought to educate the younger generation in the love of scientific truth and work, since it immerses the students in a purer, extra-personal atmosphere. And this is a field that Yemima has written about. In 1922, he said that scientifically speaking, there isn't anything in particular going on. The gravitational field is still standing side by side with the electromagnetic one. There is no unification. Truth cannot be found by pure speculation. God Almighty goes his own ways. And in 1922, when he was asked by journalists about religious truth and scientific truth, he wrote that it is not easy to attach a clear sense even to scientific truth. The word differs depending on whether it involves a fact of experience, a mathematical theorem, or a scientific theory. And under religious truth, he wrote, "I cannot conceive of anything at all." Symmetry is an interesting word that occurs much more often than truth or beauty or justice. So there's a scientific research project for the Max Planck group. Like Galileo, Newton, Darwin, and Freud, had Einstein never written a single letter, his name would still remain firmly ensconced in the firmament of scientific luminaries. But the publication and translation of his volumes and his correspondence has already and will or ought to provide fertile ground for discoveries for many decades to come. The letters can answer virtually inexhaustible questions about the period, limited only by the imagination of the historian or the philosopher. The vital contribution of this edition is not only in its discoveries of previously unpublished letters or other intriguing artifacts, for example, including this handprint. Most of Einstein's correspondence has never before been published. But more to the point, the reader will be liberated from the conventionality, the conventions and interpretations of received views. Over a period, so I want to move on to show you the size of the publication and the fact that over a period, the period of publication of the collected papers, I did research into who were the major correspondents of Einstein. And major correspondents, I mean more than 5 letters. And these 40 major correspondents, in fact, are family. I know you can't read it, but at the top is Mileva Maric and the sons, Zanger, publishers and travel, and so on. 12 of these letters, major, yes, I'm sorry, I can't make it bigger. Who, Zanger? So Robert Schulman published last year the collected correspondence of Einstein and Heinrich Zanger. Heinrich Zanger was one of Einstein's oldest colleagues, friends, supporters in Switzerland, became a confidant of Einstein, helped with Einstein's family in Zurich. He was a forensic medical specialist, a doctor. He ran various clinics, wrote scientific papers on natural disasters, carbon poisoning, industrial disasters, and so on. In addition to Ehrenfest, Zanger is probably his most important correspondent on personal matters that deal with his family, less with science of any significance. But of these letters, to or from a number of major correspondents, family and close friends make up 36%. But these family letters that people don't think might be of any interest are often very significant sources of information on his science, on his scientific meetings, on disagreements. Einstein writes to his sons, to Elsa, about things that he wouldn't write to anybody else, including his opinions on the scientific work and personalities of his colleagues. There is a lot that remains to be published. What's very interesting is to look at how many individual correspondents Einstein corresponded with. I think this data is correct, and I need to thank Dalia Mendelsohn, Ronnie Gross, Barbara Wolf for collaborating with us under the guidance and leadership of Tilman Sauer in creating an updated new website that allows us to do some very clean searches. So from 13 individuals in 1901, when he was seeking a position for the very first time, to 50 during this first year as a professor in Berlin, to 323 after the Eclipse expedition, to more than 1,000 in 1939, a convergence of his 60th birthday and the outbreak of World War I in Europe, signaling the beginning of the final catastrophe for emigrant Jews and political undesirables from Nazi Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, and lands beyond the Pale, we find that he corresponded in total over the 30 years ahead of us with 7,558 individual correspondents. These are not 7,558 different people, but individuals per year. 5,000 of these letters were with about 120 major correspondents. So 25% of his correspondence is with people whom he knows, and of these 120, only 20 were new people. So even though he emigrates in 33, only 20 people had a significant impact on his life in the United States, people with whom he devoted time to exchange letters after the immigration to the US. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, of minor correspondents, and this cluster is entirely unexamined. These numbers are important because we need to prepare ourselves that at least 12 to 15% more material will be added over the years. And I'm coming now to a conclusion. Taken together over the decades, Einstein's letters are never boring, always to the point, and only on rare occasions reveal inner turmoil, insecurity, or pain. Extreme emotions do not come naturally to him. As he himself acknowledges, "I am a creature little burdened by sentiment," he writes to Elsa, ironically, in 1924, just when he's having an affair. It is clear that Einstein was consistently happiest when he could find time for his scientific pursuits. While on board ship for a 6-week voyage to South America in the summer of 1925, he wrote home, "I'm busying myself a bit with science. It turns out that I can't bear it otherwise. When I try to stop, life becomes too empty. No reading matter can substitute for it, not even scientific reading." Shortly after his return from this trip, that is documented in volume 14, Einstein received a letter from the editorial office of the Encyclopedia Britannica soliciting 2 separate articles on space and time, and another longer article on the universe. He did not write the article on the universe. It was too much. But he wrote the article on space and time, and these essays were to be published in a 3-volume series devoted to recent developments after World War I in science and the intellect, as a supplement to the encyclopedia's famed 1911 edition. Contributors to this series included Niels Bohr, Marie Curie, Eddington, Freud, Marconi, Nansen, Bertrand Russell, Leon Trotsky, and most prolifically Arnold Toynbee. Einstein agreed to write 1 article on space-time. The latest volume, 15 of the collected papers on which we are currently working, shows that he sent it by the agreed deadline and was paid a fee of £50 sterling, a handsome reward at the time. The volume will also reproduce the German draft of his article, his correspondence with one of the encyclopedia's editors, and the published text of the English translation, setting out the consequences of general relativity. Setting out the consequences of general relativity for our understanding of the universe. At present, we're still hunting for the final German and English manuscripts, a mere footnote in the history of science, perhaps, but such is the fascination of the Nachlass of Albert Einstein. Thank you.